Look at what's happening in Germany. You look at what's happening last night in Sweden. Sweden. Who would believe this? Sweden. They took in large numbers. They're having problems like they never thought possible.
When in 2017 the then US president made these remarks about rioting in Sweden, they were met with disdain and ridicule, and no one took these seriously. Even Swedes agitated against these remarks. But 7 years down the line, everyone in Sweden is now worried about situation in Sweden. These days, when someone takes the name Sweden, people don't think of IKEA, meatballs, fika, Vikings, or archipelagos. But what popped up in their mind is rising crime rate, gang violence, and a flood of immigrants. Today, Stockholm is called as the gun, crime, and gang violence capital of Europe. Malmö is being termed as the rape capital of Europe. However, about Sweden, who would have thought like this? Nevertheless, the world's most modern, liberal, and peaceful country didn't arrive at this stage by chance. There is a story full of twists behind it. In this video, we'll uncover for you the transition of Sweden from one of the most peaceful countries in Europe to the one having the highest gun violence rate, and who is responsible for this. Stay with the Atlas shift. Sweden's territorial expansion began in the 17th and 18th centuries, which brought it into contact with diverse populations in neighboring territories, including Finland, Estonia, and parts of present-day Germany. This period saw the integration of new cultures and languages into the Swedish realm. Its reputation for religious tolerance during the 17th century attracted immigrants fleeing persecution in other parts of Europe, as it granted asylum to religious minorities such as Huguenots from France and Jews from various European countries, contributing to its multicultural fabric. Sweden then experienced the next wave of immigration in the late 19th and early 20th centuries from neighboring Nordic countries. In 1900, when it had a population of 5 million people, only 0.7% were immigrants. Of these immigrants, 63% were from Finland, Norway, and Denmark, who were attracted by economic opportunities in Sweden's burgeoning industrial sector, particularly in cities like Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö. Among these immigrants, Finnish immigrants constituted the largest group during this period, followed by Norwegians and Danes. While these early immigrants contributed to Sweden's economic development, they also faced discrimination and marginalization. Swedish society, largely homogeneous both linguistically and culturally at the time, viewed immigrants with suspicion and often subjected them to assimilationist policies aimed at erasing their cultural distinctiveness and promoting Swedish identity. The mid-20th century marked a significant shift in Sweden's immigration patterns, driven by post-war reconstruction efforts, labor shortages, and geopolitical developments. Sweden experienced an economic boom during the 1950s and 1960s, often referred to as Sweden's economic miracle, prompting the government to actively recruit labor from abroad to fuel its growing industries. Bilateral agreements were forged with countries such as Finland, Greece, Italy, Turkey, and Yugoslavia, facilitating the migration of workers to Sweden. These agreements provided labor migrants with employment opportunities and paved the way for their settlement in Sweden. While initially intended as temporary measures, many migrants chose to stay and build their lives in Sweden, laying the foundation for a multicultural society. The latter half of the 20th century saw Sweden emerge as a destination for refugees fleeing conflict, persecution, and political upheaval around the world. The 1970s, in particular, witnessed an influx of refugees from countries such as Chile, Iran, and Vietnam, seeking asylum in Sweden. The Swedish government responded by enacting the 1975 Aliens Act, which granted asylum seekers the right to seek refuge in Sweden, and introduced principles of non-discrimination and equality. The Aliens Act represented a pivotal moment in Sweden's approach to immigration, emphasizing humanitarian values, affirming the rights of ethnic and cultural minorities to preserve their identities and participate fully in Swedish society, signaling a departure from assimilationist policies. Sweden's commitment to providing sanctuary to those in need solidified its reputation as a haven for refugees, further diversifying the country's population and cultural landscape. By the late 20th century, Sweden had transitioned from a predominantly homogeneous society to one characterized by cultural diversity. The concept of multiculturalism gained prominence as a guiding principle in Swedish policymaking, emphasizing the recognition and accommodation of cultural differences within society. Multicultural policies involved various domains, including education, employment, social welfare, and cultural expression. Efforts were made to promote diversity in schools, workplaces, and public institutions, foster intercultural dialogue, and combat discrimination and prejudice. In the 21st century, Sweden continued to witness significant waves of immigration, driven by global conflicts economic opportunities, and demographic shifts. One of the key drivers of immigration to Sweden in this period was the influx of refugees escaping conflicts in the Middle East, particularly the Syrian civil war. Beginning in the early 2010s, Sweden became a destination for thousands of asylum seekers seeking safety and refuge from violence and persecution in their home countries. The expansion of the European Union in 2004 and 2007 facilitated migration from Eastern European countries like Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, as citizens of these countries gained the right to free movement within the EU. Till the third quarter of the 20th century, people were moving to Sweden, being attracted by its industrial sector and quality of life. During that period, immigrants contributed a lot to the Swedish economy by providing educated and skilled labor to its burgeoning industrial and service sectors. The average annual immigrant number continued to stand at around 6,000 till the late 1960s. However, in the late 20th century, people fleeing their homelands during the Iran-Iraq and Yugoslavia wars enhanced the number of non-European people in the Swedish population unexpectedly. The number of non-European immigrants has been increasing since then, and now around 16% of the Swedish population is non-European immigrants. Since 2000, the number of immigrants in Sweden have been doubled. During the same period when immigration reached an all-time high in Sweden, certain violent crimes also peaked. According to a report published by the Swedish National Council for Crime Prevention, over the last 20 years, from 2003 to 2023, Sweden has gone from having one of the lowest to one of the highest levels of gun violence in Europe. In 2022, the gun murder rate per 100,000 people in Stockholm was 30 times more than that of London. The report stated that the increase in gun homicide in Sweden is closely linked to the criminal milieu in socially disadvantaged areas. This line from the report gives us leads to understand the ongoing sufferings of the Sweden. The main cause of the current crisis is the combination of an open-door migration policy with a weak accompanying policy to help the newcomers integrate. This resulted in the emergence of neighborhoods where almost all residents are immigrants, where unemployment rates are very high, and where the children of immigrants go to schools where no other children, often not even teachers, are proficient in Swedish. This served as an incubator for crime, as gangs take over where society fails. Today, around 85% of the native Swedes are employed. However, employment rate among immigrants stands at only 67%. These unemployed immigrants often enter into a long-term social exclusion, and this non-integration ultimately makes these marginalized immigrants an easy target for criminal gangs to recruit, or leads to gang formation, either to earn money or to extract rights. The socio-economic conditions are the main drivers of violent crimes, including shootings and gang formation. With the rise in gun crimes, the Swedish police began tracking the areas where most of these crimes occur, and by 2021, identified 61 utsatta, or vulnerable areas. Having only 10% of the national population, these areas are connected with most violent crimes. Although these areas have a high concentration of immigrants born outside Europe and second and third generation immigrants, the socio-economic conditions of these areas are a far greater concern than the origin of the immigrants. The long-term unemployment rate in these areas, which is already far above the national average, is increasing consistently. Further compounding the issue is the proportion of people who are on the verge of poverty in these areas, and the figure stands at twice the national average. The income gap is also on rise in Sweden in recent years, and latest stats reflect that today the income gap and resultant inequality in wealth distribution is highest for past 40 years. Sweden's Gini coefficient, which is a measure of income inequality, increased sharply in 2021 and reached 0.333. which is the highest since measurements began in 1975. So for many criminologists, these are socioeconomic factors and not ethnicity that lead to crime, and the theories are proving to be true in the case of Sweden's immigrant-rich, socio-economically backward areas. Tino Sanandaji, an economist of Kurdish origin and a strong critic of Sweden's immigration policies, has revealed some startling statistics in his recent book, Mass Challenge: Socioeconomic Impact of Migration to a Scandinavian Welfare State. He writes that foreign-born represent 53% of individuals with long prison sentences, 58% of the unemployed, and receive 65% of social welfare expenditures. 77% of Sweden's child poverty is present in households with a foreign background, while 90% of suspects in public shootings have immigrant backgrounds. Resultantly, the number of Swedes who favor increased migration has dropped from 58% in 2015 to 40% today. However, if we look at the socio-economic conditions of immigrants in other developed countries like the USA, Australia, and Canada, the picture seems otherwise, at least what figures reflect. For example, in the USA, in 2023, the labor force participation rate for the foreign-born was 67%, and the native-born rate was 62%. Similarly, in the case of Australia, the gap between the employment rate of native and foreign-born is just 2.9% in favor of native Australians, and the average income of migrants in these countries is either higher or nearly equal to the natives. Now it takes us to the question, what went wrong with immigration and why socioeconomic conditions in Sweden's immigrant-rich neighborhoods are so poor? The most noticeable departure in the immigration trend was that, in the past, the people who benefited from Sweden's lax asylum policies were the educated worker class, coming from linguistically and culturally close countries who contributed to Sweden's economic development. But later, immigrants entered Sweden with the sole intent of fleeing the wars going on in their countries. Social networking, attachment to the labor market, and language skills are the most potent factors for social integration and improved socioeconomic conditions. However, of 1.5 million people who migrated to Sweden in the last 2 decades, most of them did not have educational backgrounds compatible with Sweden's knowledge-based economy and highly skill-intensive labor market. Further, culturally, they were far from the liberal Swedish traditions and environment. So, what happened then? The absence of these integrating factors made a significant portion of non-Western immigrants unable to support themselves, completely dependent on governmental support, and stuck in immigrant areas away from mainstream society. With residential areas becoming increasingly divided along ethnic and socio-economic lines, segregation emerged as a pressing concern. Segregated neighborhoods, often characterized by poverty, unemployment, and social isolation, further contributed to feelings of estrangement and bitterness among immigrant populations. As per a recent study by Nyakampis Byron today, 41% of the people who permanently moved to Sweden from 1981 to 2024 do not identify themselves as part of Swedish society. Where immigrants are to be blamed, the Swedish progressives, greatly worried by the abandonment of old ideals, point out certain shortcomings in the policies of the Swedish government that brought the country to the current situation. For example, temporary permits granted to asylum seekers often prevent them from receiving the long-term vocational training they need to enter the labor market, either by killing their intent to do so when they are being given generous social welfare benefits, or by demotivating them, as they think that they are not going to stay there for long. And this is not the only impediment to work for immigrants. To properly integrate them, Sweden also lacks a system placed in other European countries like Germany, where extraordinary programs are in place to carry the newcomers from language programs to vocational training to internships to jobs. Secondly, in Sweden, local municipalities are responsible for providing newly arrived immigrants with a basic understanding of Swedish society, their rights and obligations. They organize meetings with immigrants and play a vital role in integration projects. However, a flaw in the approach adapted by the local municipalities is that they often present Swedishness without Swedes. This absence of the meaningful interaction between immigrants and natives delays integration and often distorts the vision of two sides about each other, thereby further complicating the matter. If we sum up the whole story, Sweden brought in more refugees or immigrants than it could integrate, and when the process of integration got too slow, things started to mess up. The only way out for Sweden to put things in order is to refocus on its immigrant integration policies and to bring Swedes first, instead of Swedish to inculcate Swedishness in the newly migrated people.